Welcome to the worship services of the Graymere Church of Christ. The next few minutes are designed to help you with everyday living, finding our answers from God's Word.
If you haven't already, I hope you'll turn to Luke 21. We'll be looking at that passage as well as a few verses earlier in Luke chapter 20. Before we do that, let's remind ourselves of our verse that we're focusing on this month as we think about our theme for the year, Here to Serve. We're thinking about Mark 10 and verse 45. And if you would, let's say this together as we try to apply it to our lives. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. Let's keep that on our hearts this week and be thinking about ways we can serve others. I don't know if you feel the same way that I do, but sometimes it can be a little challenging if it's time to go to a doctor's office for a checkup, or maybe the dentist office for a checkup. I know we have doctors and dentists here and those who work in that office, and I'm thankful for the work that they do, but one of the things that can be discouraging is when you know there's something you should have been doing, and you're thinking, oh boy, we're going to have to go back and say, have I really been eating what I'm supposed to eat? Have I been doing what I'm supposed to do since the last time we had that checkup? And we know that we need it. We know that it helps us when we go back for those, but sometimes it's kind of hard to ask those tough questions. Over the last couple of weeks, as we've been thinking about the subject of stewardship and of giving to God's glory, everything that we have, I think probably we've asked some questions that would fall into that category. Questions we know we need to ask ourselves, but they're kind of tough. It's hard for us to look at what we've been given and really reflect on how we're using it. And so over these last few weeks, I assure you that if you have felt maybe that the sermon might have stepped on your toes a little bit, I can assure you it started with mine. These last few weeks have been challenging to think, what exactly am I doing? Am I making sure that I'm giving myself first to God before everything else? And as we've gone through each week, you remember the first week we looked at the concept of security. And we were reminded of the fact that we can't find our security in possessions. Sometimes we live like we can, but only God can give us true security. And then last week, we looked in depth at giving, especially giving in the New Testament, and the idea that when we give to God, we're trading something that is physical for something that is eternal. Something that is temporary for something that will yield everlasting results. And so we were reminded of just how short-lived our wealth and possessions can be. And so as we wrap up this series, we're going to be thinking this morning not just about the attitude behind giving, but the attitude that giving can help create in us. It's been a few years ago now, but you may have heard the story of Osceola McCarty. You may have been familiar with this woman pictured here with Robin Leach, who used to do the Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous TV show. He was interviewing her here. She spent years washing clothes in the town of Hattiesburg, Mississippi. And for a long time, she would make 50 cents on each load that was washed. And she didn't use any of the newfangled washing machines. She had her washing board in her way that she liked to do it, and that's the way she did. And she would just save up money that she had earned. When it was time for her to retire, she asked her banker how much she had saved. She discovered that the number was $280,000. That she had saved by living simply and by just putting things back. She decided to make a large donation for student scholarships for the University of Southern Mississippi. And she gave $150,000 to a scholarship fund. Now, if you're working in a university and if you're taking in large donations, that is probably not going to be the largest donation you'll ever get. But it made the news. And the reason it made the news was because of her life story. And although she didn't really like the attention, she was eventually taken to meet with the president and given a special award. There are some awards that have been named after her and some things that have started since then. But I like what she said when reporters asked her why she did that. She said, I had more than I could use in the bank, and I can't carry anything away from here with me. So I thought it was best to give it to some child to get an education. It's more blessed to give than to receive. I've tried it." I like that quote. I like that statement. It's more blessed to give than to receive. And she knew because she had tried it. Now, obviously, she's not the first person to say that. These are words of Jesus. And they're not words of Jesus that we see in the Gospels. Actually, they're words of Jesus that are quoted by Paul in Acts chapter 20, that it's more blessed to give than to receive. There's something that comes with giving that changes us. There's something about that that changes our attitude, that changes our outlook. And you may remember, as we've looked at some of the passages dealing with stewardship and with giving, one of the things that came up when Paul was writing to the church at Corinth was this idea of being a cheerful giver, a willing giver, someone who is gladly giving. It reminded me of a story that's floated around for years about Henry Ford. It may be apocryphal. Usually the stories that make really good sermon illustrations never actually happened, but I like the way this is worded. They say that Henry Ford was asked by a fundraiser to give to a local hospital, and he decided to give $5,000. When that newspaper headlines reported it the next day, they reported that he had given $50,000. Just 1 0 can make a lot of difference in a headline. And he was frustrated. He called up this fundraiser and said, "Listen, you need to make sure this is corrected. I only agreed to $5,000. And the fundraiser said, "Well, that's no problem. We'll just run a retraction tomorrow that says Henry Ford reduces his donation by $45,000. And as the story goes, he went ahead and paid the $50,000 because he didn't want the bad publicity. It sounds like that fundraiser had made a few of those decisions before and knew what he was doing. But that's the opposite of this kind of cheerful and willing giver. It's the opposite of saying, "Well, I have to do this." And I think sometimes when this subject comes up, we sort of feel that way. "Well, I guess I've got to do this. I guess I have to do this." But there's something in the act of giving itself that changes our attitude. And we see that displayed here in Luke chapter 20 and 21. Now, the passage that Christopher read for us is a familiar story, but I'd like for us to back up in Luke's gospel and see what happens right before then. In verse 45, "In the hearing of all the people, he said to his disciples, 'Beware of the scribes who like to walk around in long robes and love greetings in the marketplaces and the best seats in the synagogues and the places of honor at feasts, who devour widows' houses and for a pretense make long prayers. They will receive the greater condemnation.'" So he's saying this to his disciples, but it's in the presence of everyone. In other words, this would easily be overheard by people who are standing around. And it's right after he points to these particular scribes who were looking for this gratification from other people that he, in the next chapter, points to this widow who is giving these 2 copper coins. Now, the contrast here, I think, is very important for us to see. I think there's a reason that they're so close together, that in Luke's gospel, he wants us to see this contrast. And this morning, I'd like for us to look at just 2 contrasts in these passages. First, the scribe, and then this widow. The first is the contrast between consuming and giving. The contrast between trying to find something for yourself and giving to others. Consuming versus giving. A consuming attitude begins when we're totally caught up in ourselves. Now, it's very likely that there were scribes and that there were Pharisees in Jesus' day who were really trying to do what was right. But it's also true that Jesus reserves some of the harshest things he will say to refer to those Pharisees and scribes who wanted attention from other people. And just look at the list he gives in Luke chapter 20. He says they exalted themselves by wearing these long robes. We don't know exactly what that meant. It may have been that there were certain robes that they would wear on the Sabbath day, or maybe certain attire they would wear in the synagogue that would kind of set themselves apart. But something about them indicated this kind of honor that they wanted to sort of gather for themselves. And then he addresses all of the areas that would have been important in Jewish life. He starts with the marketplace. They want greetings in the marketplace. Well, that was the social center of the day. That was where you saw everybody. That's where you kept up with what was happening in your town. And so for social purposes, being in the marketplace was a big deal. You may remember in the Sermon on the Mount when we went through that, Jesus referred to people who would give or who would pray or who would fast publicly. And one of the locations was in the marketplace, on the street, so that people could see what they were doing. Then they wanted the best seats in the synagogues. The best seats or places of honor, those are sort of parallel expressions to use the first places. They wanted places of prominence. And the marketplace was important socially, and the synagogue was important spiritually. And that's where you would come together. That's where you would have the law read. This was an important place in the life of the Jewish people. And so they wanted that. They also wanted places of honor at feasts. Jesus would address them and look at all of them sort of trying to jockey for position when it came to a feast. And he would say, don't try to sit at the place of honor. Don't start off there. Try to sit at the lower place. That way, if someone comes to you and says, sit up here, that's one thing. But if you go for that place of honor and get told to go somewhere else, well, that's another. It mattered to them where they sat at these feasts. Table fellowship was important. And so in every aspect of life, these scribes Jesus is describing were concerned with people looking at them and what they could get. It was consuming rather than giving. And when we think about ourselves to the exclusion of other people, it's going to be hard for us to give. When I'm so caught up in what I want or what I'm looking to get out of a situation, it's going to be hard for me to truly serve someone else. If I look at someone and think because of my status or my position in life that person really isn't worth as much as I am, or that person really shouldn't be honored as much as I should, it's going to be hard for me to serve. It's going to be hard for me to give to that person. One author who's written extensively about the Gospel of Luke is Darrell Bach, and he told the story of a graduate course for a university that met in a building off campus. And because the building was off campus, it was kind of tricky to make sure it got locked up when class was over and make sure the building was secure. And he said that the request went out for one specific course that was kind of a short course that took place when school wasn't in session. They asked the professor just to lock up after class, just to wait till everyone had left and then lock the doors. And his response was that he didn't do that. He was the head of the department. That wasn't something he did. He was kind of above that. So then he describes finding another professor who's willing to go over there and lock the doors. Something that simple, but when we're caught up in ourselves and our own accomplishments and who we are and we think we're above something else, it changes our attitude. And this idea of consuming and seeking what will gratify us is just so easy for us to fall into. It's just such a kind of insidious temptation that's all around us. One of the most commonly misquoted verses about money is found in 1 Timothy chapter 6 and verse 10, when Paul writes, "For the love of money is the root of all kinds of evils." Now, we're familiar with that, and a lot of times people will say, well, money is the root of all evil, when Paul is pointing at something specific here, that the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. And we see that by what he says next. "It is through this craving that some have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many pangs." It's through the craving for money. Money and wealth, that's just the tool that God's given us. It's a tool we use to survive. We have to have it to survive. It's a tool we can use to bless other people. It's a tool we can use to help others. Or it's a tool that we can use in a way where we start craving wealth. And we have this desire. And Paul says that's where things get really dangerous. When I'm thinking about consuming and I'm thinking about what I can get out of a situation. And it extends beyond just what we have. It extends beyond the financial area. It extends to every aspect of my life. So I have to ask myself some tough questions. When I hear about tough economic times, if tough economic times happen in the area where we live, Am I thinking only about how that affects me? Or do I have a heart that's thinking about other people that might be affected by this and what I could do to help them? In my relationships with others, in my friendships, am I just thinking about what I can get out of this and what they can give me out of this friendship and what I can gain? Or am I thinking about how I can invest in someone else's life? When it comes to issues with my church family, am I looking just for what I can get or for what might please me? Or am I thinking about ways I can give to others, that I can help others? It's a change of mindset. And so the contrast between these scribes who were thinking about themselves is this widow who gives 2 copper coins. Now, it might be that as Jesus points this out, there is a critique of the fact that you have this poor widow who's going to give here at the temple, and she's not being taken care of. In fact, in the passage just before that, we read that these scribes were devouring widows' houses. We don't know exactly how that worked. We do know there was a practice Jesus spoke out against in Mark chapter 7, where Pharisees could declare something as Corban or dedicated to God, and that got them out of having to take care of their parents. In other words, they might have been expected to use what they had to take care of their parents, but if I can just declare this has been dedicated to God, I'm kind of exempt from that. They used it like a loophole. It's also clear that widows were an important group that needed to be taken care of in the first century. And for whatever reason, you had this woman who only had this just small amount of money to survive. It's hard for us to even imagine how small this was. It's hard to translate it into today's monetary units, but it wouldn't even be worth 2 pennies. I mean, it wouldn't even be worth that much. She gave all that she had. It's interesting to me, that contrast between consuming, what can I get, and giving. What do I have? Jesus would say that's more money than all of these big donations that were put in the temple treasury. These receptacles that some historians say would have been sort of trumpet-shaped there, you would put in. And so it might not have made much noise, but Jesus looked at those 2 coins and said that was more. Why was that more? It wasn't monetarily more. It was more because she was giving and thinking about others. It's important when we think about giving to God, and she specifically was thinking about giving to the temple. When you give to God, that contrast with this consuming sort of mentality. We see the contrast between consuming versus giving, and the contrast between abundance versus need. See, Jesus says others who were giving these large donations were giving out of their abundance. Some of them might have gotten it through means that weren't holy, the kind Jesus mentioned earlier about devouring widows' homes, or about declaring things as Corban, but there might have been others that had abundance for other reasons. But no matter which category we're in, we're called to give sacrificially. You see, it's kind of interesting. You would think that the more money someone had, the more generous that person could be. But did you know that people who've done studies, and there's more than one, that's looked at the percentage of giving, they've found that typically across the board, the more we have, the smaller the percentage we give. Isn't that interesting? We'd think it would be the other way around. But really, those surveys across the board reflect the difference we see here. That it doesn't matter how much I have, I'm called to give, whether that's abundance or whether that's not very abundant. We mentioned earlier the giving of Miss McCarty, who worked for years in Mississippi. When she looked at what she had saved up, she gave around 64% of it. That's a large majority. There might be other people who could have given that amount, but it wouldn't have been that percentage. And so we're not thinking in terms of amount. We're thinking in what do I have? Am I giving what I have? No matter where I might fall on the level between the abundance we would see in chapter 20 or the poverty we see from this widow, am I giving sacrificially? There's a passage in the Old Testament in 2 Samuel 24 that usually comes to mind when I think about this concept. Beginning in verse 18, God comes to David and gives him a command. He's going to make an altar, and there's a specific place he's going to do it, on the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite. So David went up, God had given him this command, And he goes up and approaches Araunah. And if you look at verse 20, he went out and he saw the king and the servants coming toward him. And Araunah went out and paid homage. And then as we continue in verse 21, he asks, why has my lord the king come to his servant? David said, to buy the threshing floor from you in order to build an altar to the Lord, that the plague may be averted from the people. Then Araunah said to David, let my lord the king take and offer up what seems good to him. Here are the oxen for the burnt offering and the threshing sledges and the yokes of the oxen for the wood. All this, O king, Araunah gives to the king. And Araunah said to the king, may the Lord your God accept you. But the king said to Araunah, no, but I will buy it from you for a price. I will not offer burnt offerings to the Lord my God that cost me nothing. Now here you have someone who's willing just to give David what he needs in order to fulfill this command. But he makes an interesting statement. He says, I'm not going to just use something or take something. I'm not going to sacrifice to God if it doesn't cost me anything. There are some things that we do in life that can be helpful to others, but don't require a lot from us. There are some things we can do that might bless the lives of others, but don't really cost much to us. And so I have to ask myself, am I willing to obey God? Am I willing to give even when it costs me, even when it's a sacrifice? Am I willing to give an amount of time that's really going to cost me? That's going to keep me from doing things that I really would rather do with this time? Am I willing to give that time for ministry and serving God? There might be something that I know needs to be done, and maybe I'm one of the best people that could do it, but am I really willing to make that sacrifice to do that for the church or to do that in service to God, even though it'll cost me? And so we're reminded when we think about no matter where we are on this scale we see here in Luke 20 and 21, whatever situation we're in, we're called to give sacrificially. It's about more than an altar here. For David, it's about what this sacrifice costs. You remember when we read through 2 Corinthians and we talked about those Christians in Macedonia who were giving, and Paul says that they gave abundantly, they gave with generosity, but they did it out of their poverty. I don't have to be rich to be generous. By the way, I don't have to be rich or wealthy to be materialistic either. It's possible to become so focused on possessions, no matter how many I might have, that I can become materialistic. We can be greedy or materialistic with a lot or with a little, and we can be generous with a lot or with a little. Our choice is which path are we going to take. So the contrast here between consuming and giving, the contrast here between abundance and need, and abundance and poverty, reminds us that while God doesn't expect more of us than we can give, He does expect us to use what we have in service to Him. One thing I've noticed as we've gone through and thought about some of these passages in the New Testament is not just how important what giving was to the early church, but how they were willing to sacrifice so that they could take care of others in the church. That giving to Christians into the church was of vital importance. You know, there are a lot of good organizations that exist today. There are a lot of groups who are doing great things. I hope you're involved with many of those. I know that you are. And I'm right there with you. I want all of us to support good things that are happening. But there's only one organization, there's only one group, there's only one effort that we could give to that Jesus died for. There's only one institution that exists because Jesus gave His blood and sacrificed for it. And so when I'm wanting to give to bless the lives of others, I need to remember the importance of giving to God, of supporting His church. There are a lot of other good things I could do, and those are great to be involved in, but I need to remember what the most important thing I could give to is, what the most important way I could pour out my talents and my time and my effort to bless the lives of others. One of the things people are saying about the millennial generation, and many of those today, is that there's this desire to change the world, and I love that. A desire to do something that impacts the world. It's exciting to think about. And people are dreaming big about what they could do to impact the world. And I think that's great and wonderful, but I want us to remember that when God wanted to change the world, He established the church. What if we started viewing the church as the way the world could be changed? The church is the way the world could be turned upside down. I think we might have a view that's pretty close to what we see in the book of Acts, that God wants to change the world and He wants to do it through His people, through the church. So it's not that we don't support other wonderful things, it's just that we remember the price that was paid for the church and the important mission that we have and the work that we have to do. We can, with God working through us, make an impact on the world. And one of the keys in making that happen is going to be us pouring out our resources that God has given us in service to Him. And so we see in this contrast that giving changes us. It changes our attitude. It changes our focus. No matter what situation we're in, it takes our minds off ourselves and focuses us to look on something outside ourselves. I have a friend who does mission work in Sudan, and one of the mission reports he was giving, he described all of the great effort that was taking place, and they've done some wonderful things with all of these churches that have been planted in different areas of Sudan, and some areas that are not always safe, but where the gospel's been able to spread. And he stood up and he gave a list of all the costs that were going to take place. And he had, I thought, a pretty memorable line after that. He said, "The good news is we have all the funds we need to make this happen." It's pretty good. I mean, we were all pretty excited about that. Then his follow-up was what was really memorable. He said, "The bad news is it's all still in our wallets." And I thought, well, I guess that's kind of a clever way, to get at the point that he was going to be making a request for some support coming up. But it's not just what's a financial resource I have. It's for any resource in my life. Many times I know what needs to be done. I know what can be done, but I'm still kind of holding on to that decision. I know what I need to be spending my time doing, and there's nothing stopping me, but I'm maybe a little bit reluctant. I know what I need to do here, but I'm a little bit reluctant. And this morning, when it comes to giving and gifts, there's no greater gift we could think of than the gift of salvation that has been given. We could not buy it, we couldn't afford it, but through the blood of Jesus that's been given to us, if we're willing to take God at His word, to submit our will to His and to serve Him. And this morning, if you've been kind of holding on to that decision and maybe just haven't quite let yourself go and haven't quite made that decision, now would be a great time to come forward, to turn your life around, to put Christ on in baptism. Or it may be that there's another issue you've kind of been holding on to, something that needs to be changed, something that needs to be different. And even if you don't come forward this morning, I hope all of us this week will think about one little thing that we might need to let go of in service to God. If there's any way we can help you, please come as we stand and as we worship together.
Graymere Church of Christ is a congregation of Christians who believe the Bible is the inspired Word of God. Following the New Testament pattern, we're trying to meet the needs of the people in this community and throughout the world. We invite you to worship with us at Graymere Church of Christ, which meets at 1320 Trotwood Avenue in Columbia, Tennessee. You'll always receive a warm welcome. If you have a question or comment about today's program, call 931-388-4796. We hope you will join us again next week as we study the Bible.